Welcome. It is my pleasure to convene this panel, Regenerating Graves, Media Adaptations of the Work and Thought of Robert Graves. This panel's objective is to provide a set of interdisciplinary readings that look at adaptations, revisions, and reinventions of the work of poet, novelist, and mythographer Robert Graves, and to consider how adaptations alter, preserve, and revitalize a single author's work. Despite the continued growth of Graves' scholarship, with over 45 dissertations and master's theses written in the last decade, as well as numerous monographs, several biographies, journal essays, and book chapters, the relevance of Graves' work to later generations of writers has gone somewhat undiscussed. Similarly undiscussed has been the fraught relationship of media adaptations to the public perception of Graves' work. With the recent release of The Laureate, a 2021 film treatment of Graves' personal relationships in the 1920s, drawn significantly from Graves' autobiographical writings, as well as a second BBC production of the Claudius novels, it becomes increasingly necessary to extend critical focus to the question of media transpositions. Engaging questions of influence, adaptation, creative transposition, and what we are calling regeneration. Regenerating Graves will help to shine a light on the idiomatic relationship of a writer who fled modernity to live in a rustic farming village and insisted on writing with a quill pen to the contemporary technological and technocratic society, as well as larger questions of influence and reception. Our speakers today are Christopher Simon and Michael Joseph. And I will introduce both speakers, and then they will be coming up to the podium to give their papers. Christopher Simon's paper, Creation and Translation, Robert Graves, Suetonius, and the Julio-Claudian Dynasty, is what you will be hearing first. And Christopher Simon met Robert Graves when he was a young boy. Christopher went on to study classics at Balliol College, Oxford, and receive a PhD in classical archaeology from the University of California, Berkeley in 1986. His research interest is in early Greek religion, and he has worked on excavations in Greece, Turkey, and Cyprus. He moved into academic administration at the turn of the millennium, but he has remained actively interested in the ancient world as an independent scholar. Michael Joseph's paper, How Video Murders the Face in the Mirror. Michael retired as a full professor from Rutgers University in 2019, where he was the rare books librarian and taught courses in children's literature. In 1998, he taught the first online course at the university. He has written 14 one-of-a-kind and limited edition artist books, including Puss in Boots on Mars. He has edited several anthologies, most recently All of a Kind, Remembering Jane Cummins, 2020, and since 2012 has been editor of the Robert Graves Review. Recent publications include How English Poetry Learned to Get Angry After 500 Years of Having a Stiff Upper Lip, In Emotions as the Engine of History, Routledge, 2021, A Different Look from The Face in the Mirror in the Robert Graves Review, 2021, and poems of his have recently appeared in Book 2.0 and are in press in Hybrido, a bilingual journal, and the COVID Files, an anthology of pandemic poems, coming out in 2023. So it is my pleasure to first welcome Christopher Simon to the podium.
Good afternoon. I'm delighted to be part of the 2023 MLA convention. Today, I'm going to talk about the poet Robert Graves' two historical novels, I, Claudius, and Claudius the Guard, and their subsequent treatment in other media, film, theatre, and television. First, a confession. I'm not a neutral party in this discussion, as my family knew Robert Graves well. My parents met Graves and his family in Devon during the Second World War in the summer of 1942. We were invited to Dare in the 1960s, and my sister, Julia Simone, became Graves' last muse in October 1966, when I was 11 years old. Heavily influenced by Robert and enjoying his books on Greek mythology, I decided to read classics at university. Robert Graves began researching Claudius in 1929, but put aside the project shortly thereafter. He began writing I, Claudius in 1932, and the book was published in May of 1934. Claudius the Guard followed just 6 months later. The narrative device is that the books are Claudius's secret history of his life, written entirely by himself in Greek, not Latin. At the beginning, Claudius/Graves writes, "In the present work, I swear by all the gods, I am my own mere secretary and my own official analyst." In contrast, Graves himself did not work alone. The novels were written when he and Laura Riding were living in Mallorca on the edge of the village of Dea. Even in the 1930s, a steady stream of interesting people came to stay with Graves and Riding. One young woman, Mary Elledge, arrived in Dea at the time Graves began working on the books. Graves induced her to type a manuscript in return for finding her housing in the village. Other visitors included Ellis Roberts and her partner Jacob Bronowski. Ellis Roberts, who had studied classics at Cambridge, ended up carefully proofreading the manuscript of I, Claudius. She said she found few corrections were needed, so deeply immersed was Graves in that world. His brother John also helped Graves with a translation of the surviving Claudian edict for Claudius the Guard. Laura Riding is thanked in the introduction of both books for her suggestions on the congruity of the English. The Claudius books were immediately successful. They helped Graves deal with his dire financial problems, and they saved his home, Cananoon. The books are remarkable works of historical fiction, which in addition to describing the machinations of the imperial court, include detailed accounts of adventures throughout the far-reaching Roman Empire. Graves, not surprisingly, showed himself very familiar with military history, with a clear anti-German bias. Graves says Claudius's brother, the General Germanicus, writing a letter that, quote, "The Germans are the most insolent and boastful nation in the world when things go well with them. But once they are defeated, they are the most cowardly and abject." In addition, the books cover Roman education, the different approaches of the Roman historians Livy and Pollio, the administration of the empire, the detailed workings of the Senate, and a thorough account of the career of Herod Agrippa. Graves identified strongly with Claudius. In a 1969 interview for the Paris Review, Graves explained, "I didn't think I was writing a novel. I was trying to find out the truth about Claudius, and there was some strange, confluent feeling between Claudius and myself. I found out that I was able to know a lot of things that happened without having any basis, except that I knew that they were true." The Claudius books were then an early example of what Graves later called the analeptic method, the intuitive discovery of forgotten events by a deliberate suspension of time. Laura Riding didn't like the books, and Graves himself, in a 1935 letter to his friends Tom and Julie Matthews, insisted that, quote, "Neither of them is of any real worth. How can the reviving of anyone as dead as Claudius be justified except as a literary conjuring trick?" Despite this, Graves was sensitive to comments about the accuracy of the books. In the introduction to Claudius the Guard, he wrote, "Some reviewers of I, Claudius, the prefatory volume to Claudius the Guard, suggest that in writing it, I had merely consulted Tacitus's Annals and Suetonius's 12 Caesars, run them together, and expanded the result with my own vigorous fancy. This was not so, nor is it the case here." He then lists a large number of ancient sources, some quite obscure, to demonstrate his thorough research. In reality, Graves always had a complex and uneasy relationship with academe, and was not fully confident in his scholarship. In May of 1934, Graves wrote to Tom Matthews pointing out, "Needless to say, I'm not a classical scholar or anything of that sort, but there is a story somewhere hidden in that confused and rather dreary history, and I have tried to dig it out. If I had been a classical scholar, my historical conscience would not have let me invent a thing." When Edward Marsh, Graves' friend and arts patron, wrote to say how much he liked the second book, Graves wrote back, "I'm so glad that you liked Claudius the Guard. It meant a lot of work for me, because I was never a classical scholar of any distinction and stopped dead off when the war broke out. And you know how careful one has to be, even in fiction. The success of the Claudius books owes most to its dramatic portraits of the imperial family, especially the women, the scheming Livia, the errant daughter Julia, Claudius's cold mother Antonia, the difficult wives Messalina and Agrippina. The imperial women in the book are ambitious, scheming, murderous, and fond of the use of poison and witchcraft. One of the few sympathetic women in the books is Calpurnia, Claudius's faithful prostitute, although she does not come to life as a fully realized character. The complex presentation of difficult and unusual women has been fodder for commentators and biographers. One may note particularly Livia's refusal to sleep with Augustus and Messalina's contrivances to avoid sharing a bed with Claudius. The biographers have all been quick to compare this with the strange reality of Graves' apparently sexless life with Laura Riding at the time the books were written. In the collection of autobiographies of living authors, Authors Today and Yesterday, published in 1934, Riding wrote, "I like men to be men and women to be women, but I think that bodies have had their day." This is in line with an earlier condemnation of sexual relations in her essay, The Damned Thing, in her 1928 book, Anarchism is Not Enough. To quote one striking sentence from that essay, "Woman, to save herself from boredom, is obliged to enliven the scene with a few gratuitous falsetto terms, which he interprets as cooperation." Not long after their publication, there was hope of more success of the stories with a film version of the Claudius novels. Graves had sold the film rights to Alexander Korda, who, with Joseph von Sternberg as his director, planned a very ambitious cinematization of the story with a top cast of British actors, Charles Laughton as Claudius, Flora Robson as Livia, Merle Oberon as Messalina, and others. Rushes from this doomed project are all that survive, but provide tantalizing glimpses of a remarkable performance by Laughton and indicate that the film would have been a striking visual spectacle. However, the production was beset with difficulties, including challenges with Laughton's performance. He clearly had great difficulty getting into the part and became obsessed with modelling his performance on the abdicated king, Edward VIII. When Merle Oberon was injured in a car accident in March of 1937, it was decided to abandon the film. The book, prepared by Graves to go along with the film, The Fool of Rome, was discarded. This was the point when Graves probably formed his idea of a Claudian curse on attempts to film or stage these novels. 20 years later, in 1957, Graves returned to the world of the Roman emperors when he translated Suetonius' 12 Caesars from Latin to English for Penguin Books. Again, Graves had no shortage of helpers. His faithful secretary, Carl Goldschmidt, who had anglicized his name to Kenneth Gay, helped him with the book. Also, Alistair Reid, a classical scholar, did a rough first translation of the Latin for Graves to revise. In his fascinating memoir of his at times difficult relationship with Graves in the New Yorker in 1995, Reid describes Graves' pencil corrections, all of which Reid considered improvements. Graves apparently didn't focus on the Latin, but he gave Reid a masterclass in writing. Reid writes, "He became for me the reader over my shoulder." The 12 Caesars was one of a flurry of translations that Graves worked on in the 1950s. The art of translation is of course a complex one. In his introduction to one of his most successful translations, The Golden Ass, published in 1950, Graves wrote about translation that it is, quote, essentially a moral problem. How much is owed to the letter and how much to the spirit? Graves was not a literal translator. Laura Boychenko, in a fine unpublished paper, demonstrates how in some cases the translation from the Latin of Suetonius was more accurate in the novels than it was in the official translation. The idea of filming the Claudius books persisted. Corder's younger brother, Vincent, started a project in 1956 which would have starred Alex Guinness in a script written by Graves. This project came to nothing. In 1971, John Mortimer, the barrister and author, wrote a screenplay for a proposed Claudius movie to be directed by Tony Richardson. Unfortunately, no one had told Graves about this project, and he wrote an angry public letter to the London Evening Standard, stating he was surprised he hadn't been consulted. He reminds the Evening Standard readers that no film has been completed yet, quote, due to the Emperor's objection to having his unfortunate physical disabilities paraded on the screen. He continues in the letter, I sincerely hope that Tony Richardson's version will not once more draw down Claudius's divine anger, and much regret that my advice on this matter has not been asked. The letter's editor at the Evening Standard must have been delighted and added the bold headline to the letter section, Claudius's Wrath by Robert Graves. Richardson could not raise the funds, and so this project too was abandoned. Mortimer then produced a new script for the stage in lieu of a film script. Copies of Mortimer's screenplay and stage script are in the Graves Archives in St John's College, Oxford. Fortunately for me, there is also a copy of the screenplay in the Bancroft Library, the rare books collection of the University of California, Berkeley, which I have read. I have not yet been able to access a copy of the stage script. The stage version, directed by Tony Richardson, opened at the Queen's Theatre in London on July the 11th, 1972. Despite an appreciation for the work of the actor, David Warner, who played Claudius, the reviews were terrible and still today are difficult to read. In the Listener magazine, the reviewer Eden Higgins mocked the dialogue. You don't miss the broth, do you, Calpurnia? Calpurnia also played a prominent part in Mortimer's screenplay for the unmade film. It may have been a mistake to dwell so much on Calpurnia, who is not a particularly believable character in the books. The play closed 2 months after it opened. Graves himself enjoyed the play and wrote to a friend who was surprised by its abrupt closure. Quote, the gallery and upper circles loved Claudius. The stalls, who pay the most, liked it the least. I hope it goes to the USA where they would not make the same mistakes. At a party before the play's opening, Graves attended a party before the opening of the play with Mortimer, Richardson, and the Liberal Party leader, Joe Grimmond, where Graves announced, of course, Jesus Christ lived to the age of 80, went to China and discovered spaghetti. Graves was now 77, and age was beginning to take a toll. Finally, the 1976 television adaptation of I, Claudius broke the curse, or almost broke the Claudian curse. Two of the key creators of the BBC series, the producer Martin Lysmore and the writer Jack Pullman, both died within a year of the series ending. Also, Brian Blessed, who played Augustus, recalled one of the extras choking on his food and dying at an I, Claudius party. The television series was remarkably lacking in the spectacular scenes Corder was aiming for in his version. Entirely filmed on the BBC set at the television centre near Shepherd's Bush, London, the series avoided spectacular imagery. Games in the Colosseum just showed the imperial family's box, with loud sound effects to suggest the unseen crowds in the gladiatorial events. The television series focuses on the imperial family, the scheming women and their husbands, sons and lovers, and pays less attention than the books to the wider Roman Empire. Graves visited the set in July 1976, aged 81, along with my mother and I. There he met the actors and saw some of the filming. Derek Jacobi, Claudius in the series, later revealed he was shocked by Graves' mental deterioration. At lunch, Graves announced he was 140 years old. Graves would never have watched the television series. He did not watch television, nor did he have one. The success of the series led to increased sales of the books, which helped pay for Graves' care in his last year. Some elements of the television production would have shocked him. Half-naked African dancers appear in the opening scene. I remember going to the cinema with Graves as a teenager, and he almost walked out when a new woman appeared on the screen. Indeed, his inherent modesty meant that Graves even avoided using the most salacious details from Suetonius in the novels, omitting, for example, the graphic details of Tiberius's sexual appetites. One of the most unforgettable images in the television series was Caligula appearing after having apparently cut open his own sister to remove their unborn incestuous child from the womb. This gruesome event is a creation of the writer Jack Pullman's and is not in any ancient sources, nor is it in the Claudius books. The regeneration of the Claudius books continues. A BBC Radio 4 adaptation for radio appeared in 2010, and in 2011, HBO was said to be considering a remake. The afterlife of the 1930s potboilers has indeed been remarkable, although none of the adaptations have truly captured the quality and charm of the original books. The continued attempts show how strongly the books impact those who read them. From the beginning, as we have seen, Graves was conflicted about the success of these books. In a 1969 interview, he stated, "I am a poet, and I put very little value on my prose work." However, he was also pleased with the recognition the books received, and not just because their success helped solve his financial difficulties. We have seen how he was both proud and insecure about his scholarship. His work, especially his interpretation of the Greek myths, has been criticized by some classical scholars, but nevertheless one of his dearest friends was the Regius Professor of Greek at Oxford, Sir Hugh Lloyd-Jones, who appreciated Graves' searching and poetic mind. Graves saw himself as an outsider, especially after he felt forced to leave England for Mallorca in 1929, and this may explain his sympathy for the unlikely stammering and limping Emperor Claudius. Graves encouraged and in some cases was directly involved in many of the Claudius film and theatre projects. He also became more and more deeply invested in his own myth of Claudius who cursed attempts to film his works, and at the same time Claudius who always seemed to provide Graves with funding when he needed it. His real work on Claudius, however, was completed in 1934. After that point, he worked tirelessly on countless other projects while always prioritizing his poetry. His tombstone in Dea simply reads, Robert Graves, Poeta. Thank you.